until we get to that, until we hear him speaking, let's talk about that legislation. A new challenge says that the COVID-19 pandemic is now becoming endemic. The disaster regulations are unfit for purpose. Is it time to drop them? What other tools can government use to keep us safe? Professor Elmien du Plessis teaches law at Northwest University. She's previously said we must work out how to exit the state of disaster. She joins us now to share some insights into what needs to happen. Professor, thank you so much for your time. So, Cooperative Governance Minister Dr. Nkosazana Dlamini-Zuma saying the current state of disaster is required to augment the legislation that we have because they need that to help government departments deal with the coronavirus pandemic. Is that augmentation still necessary?
Yes, so I think one needs to start at the beginning to ask, what is the Disaster Management Act made for? So the Disaster Management Act, similar to the State of Emergency Act, is made for emergency situations. So that's when government is faced with something that they must deal with that cannot be dealt with in ordinary legislation. And that was certainly true in the beginning of March in 2020. Sorry, it's such a long time ago. But in the meantime, we have to learn how to live with this virus. We know now what is necessary to prevent a surge in infections. It's mostly non-pharmaceutical interventions and vaccinations. It's like mask wearing, social distancing. And then the question is it necessary to use emergency legislation that puts quite a lot of power in the hands of the executive, because the executive can act quickly, to regulate that? Or can we now move to something like the National Health Act that makes provision for the making of regulations very similar to mask wearing and social distancing and other non-pharmaceutical interventions to continue with regulating COVID? And the reason why that is important is because when we deal with emergency legislation like the Disaster Management Act, as I said, the power pivots to the executive. Parliament does not really have that much power to intervene with the decisions of the executive. I know the courts have found that in the portfolio committees, etc., they can have some form of input, but obviously we need to go back to a normal way of making legislation as soon as possible. And I certainly think we have crossed that point. But the problem that the government is facing at the moment is all the regulations that we do have that makes provision for mask wearing, for social distancing, and all these non-pharmaceutical and other interventions that we do need to manage COVID. That is done under the Disaster Management Act, and that is dependent on a state of emergency being there. So as soon as we no longer have a state of emergency, all those regulations will immediately collapse. So unless there's some sort of hand over to another set of regulations that's made more democratically in Parliament with the input of other parties and other stakeholders, there will be a problem for government to just stop declaring a state of disaster. And I think that is the point where we are now at.
Well, you've said that you believe it's possible to exit the state of disaster. There are steps that government can take. Take us through that and what the process would be, how immediate this could happen.
So, as I said, the National Health Act makes provisions for the Minister of Health to make regulations. Those regulations, in terms of the National Health Act, needs to be in Parliament for 3 months for input, for public participation. There are ways to accelerate that. So this might be a situation where it warrants the acceleration of the making of those regulations. And as soon as we have those regulations, it would be possible to exit the state of disaster. So I think the pressure should now be on government to start making use of normal legislation to make the regulations that's still needed to manage COVID, and then to say, well, now we have those regulations now, there's absolutely no reason for us to be in a state of disaster. Whether a court can do it, that's another question. I'm not sure on what grounds the court case will be brought in front of the court. I think the most that the court can do, if they agree with the applicants that we no longer need to be in a state of disaster, is to say, well, there's no longer authority for a state of disaster, or it's no longer possible in law, and then give the government 3 months or so in order to get the house in order before the end of a state of disaster. But I do speculate, and this is speculation, I do speculate at least 2-3 months still that we will be in a state of disaster until we reach that point where we can go on to normal legislation.
What are the checks and balances to ensure that a state of disaster isn't abused, Professor?
Yeah, okay, so that's a very difficult question to answer in a sense, because what happens when we go into this, so there's a hazard like COVID, we see, okay, there's something that might need extraordinary intervention. The National Disaster Management Center, they say, okay, we are dealing with a disaster. It goes within the definition of a disaster. And then the National Disaster Management Center says we classify this as a disaster, and they can then say it's a national disaster, which then enable the minister to call a state of disaster. So that's your first check. It's not a decision that the minister makes on her own. It's made by the National Disaster Management Center, which is independent. But the courts have found that, you know, other than the various forms of input that interested parties gave into the regulations, although they were not as thorough as normal legislation would be, the court found that the oversight that Parliament has in terms of the Portfolio Committee, especially the Committee on cooperative governance and then also on health, that was adequate. But as I said, we are now 24 months plus almost into the, 22 months, sorry, into the state of disaster. Times have changed. Whether the courts will still find that is questionable. That decision can change, of course. The courts can say, listen, you've had so much time, you had enough time to come up with other ideas. It does not warrant this extraordinary measure. So I think, the courts are also a check on that balance. And I think that would be interesting if somebody goes to court to challenge these regulations, whether the courts would still defer so much to the executive as they did in the beginning of the pandemic.
All right, Professor, thank you so much for your time. Professor Elmien du Plessis of Northwest University.